Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I wanted to talk today about the next two articles on the syllabus. They're concerning cultural relativism by Harry Gensler and David Enoch, and quite interesting. In philosophy you become a collector of arguments, good and bad. The argument for cultural relativism is one of the worst, weakest arguments I think I've ever seen, and so I'm going to be kind of merciless in the way I approach this. But two different ways of approaching the argument. Both authors think that relativism is wrong, as you've probably seen, but okay. What really the thesis says about cultural relativism, which might show up in anthropology and sociology and psychology, and historians have this approach as well, is that good and bad are relative to culture. So if, in other words, if you were to put that in the terms of an argument, a premise and a conclusion, if culture X thinks that Y is good, then Y is good. Why? Because culture X says so. This seems to be ridiculous. To think of what would follow that. Nazism is good then, if we substitute for culture X. Since 1930s and 1940s, Germany thought so, right? So culture X, Nazi Germany, thinks that Y is good. The Nazism and the doctrine of Aryan supremacy. So therefore, it is good because they thought so. Let's take some further implications of this. Intolerance of women, gays, and apostasy is just because certain Islamic countries think it is. That's not the case. If it's just because a group of people think something is good, obviously doesn't make it so. So that's the absurdity of this, leaping from a premise which might be factual in this case. In fact, you can study the different cultures that I just mentioned, and it is factual to say that they believe those things. But it doesn't follow that those things, because they believe them, are good. A third example, animal torture is just, I'm substituting the word just for good here, since bullfighting is legal in most areas of Spain and Portugal. Well, bullfighting is animal torture. It's a slow death for the animal. There's these rods rammed into him looking like spears until he gets sluggish, bleeds out, and is stabbed back of his head in the brain at the last part. And this is a slow death despite all the people cheering it on. So just because culture X thinks that animal torture is good doesn't mean that it is good. The Iditarod, which occurs for over 100 years around this time of the year in Alaska, Iditarod with the dog racing, the sled racing with dogs, where the musher takes the dog through the snow, sometimes 1,000 miles over 10 days. Dogs end up dying and are abused in order so the musher can win a modest prize. Just because this idea is practiced every year, this practice goes on each year, doesn't make it good. This is a fallacy to say that we believe in X, therefore X is true. Slavery was right before the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, since many slaveholders believed it was. So the culture of X, Friday 1863, thought that slavery was good, therefore it is good. Pretty bad argument, pretty shallow argument really. Or try one more. It was legal to keep women from voting in France until 1944. Therefore it is morally right to keep them from voting. Just because it had the status of legality, therefore widely practiced, doesn't mean that it was right. So all such arguments, I would say, commit, although Gensler doesn't say this, but the logician in me hastens to point it out, that all such arguments commit the ad populum fallacy. The ad populum fallacy is when you say something is true because many people believe it. X is true because a majority of people believe it. The Earth is at the center of the solar system, let's say, not the Sun, according to the old geocentric hypothesis, because a majority of people believe it. That's not true. That's the ad populum fallacy. It's appeal to the population or appeal to the majority. That's never the case. And all these culturally relative fallacies commit this fallacy. Gensler brilliantly invents these two characters, I'm a relativist and like a rebel. And I'm a relativist just believes whatever the dictates of her society say are true. So she's a conformist. And if her society, let's say, her culture tolerates intolerance, some of the societies I just mentioned did tolerate intolerance, then that's good according to I'm a relativist, because she thinks the goal or the good of any person is just to obey the rules of that society. Like a rebel, the other person he invents here, is someone who rebels against the dictates of the culture. And when everyone is marching one way, she marches the other way, and she has the courage to disagree or to not conform. So the odd thing is here that the nonconformist is the morally more advanced of the two. The conformist, whether in Nazi Germany, slave time America, or Islamic societies that practice what I just said, it's the conformist who is morally backward. It's the nonconformist who looks forward and challenges the dictates of the society and has courage. So there are many other implications that he draws out about this, Gensler does. First of all, relativism cannot allow for disagreement. If the norms of the society are determined by the majority of that society, then anyone else by definition is wrong. If 51% think that capital punishment is just and 49% think it's unjust, for instance, then the 51% would always have to be right. We just take a head count to find out who's right. He says relativism cannot defend tolerance in these societies where intolerance is the norm. I just mentioned that. Relativism is a counsel of conformity. So one application, children should be taught to disagree with the norms of the society. Finally, the fourth implication of this is that if you're part of a subculture, which do you agree with, the norms of the subculture or the larger culture? So this is, if I'm a membership of a subculture, like the Hells Angels or the far right, or a subculture that believes that we should not listen to doctors and not practice social distancing, then what do I do when that subculture conflicts with the truths of the larger culture? So that's the relativism is given a rough time by Gensler. I give it a rough time too, and the arguments are, I think, exceedingly shallow. That something is right because people practice it or believe it. It's a fact that there are differences in cultures. That much we know. For instance, if you take a poll about abortion in Catholic Spain, a majority will disagree with abortion. If you take the poll in Japan, a majority will agree. That's intercultural relativism, so those are factual things. Likewise, if you take a poll about abortion in the Northeast of the United States, a majority will think that it should be kept legal and it's justified. If you take that same poll in the Bible Belt region of the Deep South, then the majority there will think it's not justified. So there's a case of two pockets of a given culture, or actually you could say two cultures, two subcultures, disagreeing about something. So the factual part is that there are disagreements, but the fallacy comes in when we leap from the premise that things are factually this way, that they ought to be this way, or they're right to be this way. Lots of historical examples of people believing something that was false. I analogize it to math and history. If there was a whole culture of people that believed that 3 times 6 equals 21, it wouldn't matter. If the majority believes such a thing, that's still wrong. So too, if the majority of people believe that the stock market crash occurred in October of 1931, that would still be false. So we don't, notice that with math and history, we don't allow a majority to dissuade us from what we already know. So then I say, if it's true in math and history, why, and science too, I can point out, then why would it be true in ethics? Just majorities alone don't make something true. So that's something to be aware of here. What I just said about history and math and ethics also applies to David Enoch's article. So David Enoch's article is entitled, Why I'm an Objectivist About Ethics and You Are Too. Objectivist is a word introduced there to be the negation of relativism. You're either a relativist or an objectivist. And obviously both of these philosophers are objectivists about ethics. I like where he introduces counterfactuals on pages 212 and 213. That's really the gist of his entire argument there. And so he has examples of smoking and gender-based discrimination. So he says, suppose there was a society in, let's make it 2020, whose practices and beliefs were such that they thought tobacco was not a carcinogenic. And they smoked freely, 3-4 packs a day. They, let's say, chewed tobacco, smoked cigarettes and cigars. Their practices and beliefs, this is called a this thought experiment he makes up is called the counterfactual, or something that is contrary to fact. So the thought experiment is imagine such a society who believes such a thing, and not only believes it intellectually that the tobacco is harmless, but practiced it freely. Would that make it true? Well, clearly not. They could go on believing what they want and practicing what they wanted, but still, in fact, it is false. And he takes another example about gender-based discrimination. If there was a society that believed, the first example, of course, scientific, the second example about ethics, if there's a second society that believes that gender-based discrimination is correct, is morally justified, and that you can treat men one way with respect, let's say, to the job market, and men another way, just because it was practiced and believed by the given society, that would not make it right. So in that thought experiment, no matter what people believe, no matter how fervently they believed it or how long they've practiced it, that would not make it right. So that counterfactual example shows that the moral truth of the matter has nothing to do with what people believe. The truth is independent of belief. It's not, another way to put it is that moral truth is not perceiver dependent. It is just in a way like mathematical truth or historical truth or scientific truth, as I was just mentioning a moment ago. So if you were part of some culture, imagine, let's continue the thought experiment, if you're part of some culture or majority that believed that the best thing to do was go back to work, socialize, and cease all practices concerning social distancing, would that make it so? Well, we seem to have, in this case, right about now, a president who wants to get people back to work. He has these deadlines in mind. First it was Easter Sunday, which is today, and then now he has May 1st as a deadline. If he believes this fervently and has many people who follow him who do believe it, according to polls, there are such people, does that make it right? I think you can apply David Enoch's philosophy, not to mention my own, and show that that kind of counterfactual reality would not make it true, would still be false no matter how many people believed it. So this is, someone made a comparison between this and climate change. If a majority of people believe that climate change is false, that doesn't, in fact, make it false, or even, not that the majority do believe it, but if a majority believe that it's nothing to worry about, just like some of our leaders thought it was nothing, the coronavirus was nothing to worry about in February and early March, that doesn't make it so. Okay, well that's those two articles, and I think that's all we need for today. I'll see you shortly with the next two articles, and I hope you're doing well, and if you are, stay well, don't take any chances, all right? Thank you, bye.